So, as I mentioned in the Haftarah, we read about the birth of Samson. And in the Parsha, we have the Nazarite laws. So that's the connection. It should be noted that there's a difference between Samson and the Nazarites in the Parasha. The two main ones are that Samson is supposed to be a lifelong Nazarite. And of course, we know that when he lets Delilah convince him to get a haircut, I mean, my wife convinces me to get a haircut, nothing bad happens other than, that cost me, $40 with a tip, but, Samson, it turns out to be not so good, right? But so, because his vow is supposed to be lifetime, not for a limited period. The other is that he didn't make the vow voluntarily, right? His father was Manoah, and his mother's name was Manoah's wife. And his mother, Manoah's wife, dedicated him as a Nazarite, and in fact, he was a Nazarite in utero. I mean, she was not allowed to drink any intoxicant. I mean, it's probably a good idea not to drink intoxicant when you're pregnant anyway, but it may have not been known at the time, but she basically had to fulfill the Nazarite rules when she was pregnant with him so that he wouldn't become deconsecrated in utero. Okay, now, but the Nazarite vow in the Torah is temporary, right? And as I mentioned in my 2-minute Torah, at the end of your Nazarite period, you have to bring a chatat, which, for the sake of this drasha, to take understanding the point of, we'll say that means sin offering. Okay, it's not clear that it actually does, but most of the commentators also believe it's a sin offering, but the vows are meant to be temporary. And then when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, and there were people who were Nazarites, and all of a sudden, can't bring the sin offering because there's no temple, right? And if you don't bring the sin offering, you are stuck in perpetual Nazariteship, which was not your intention nor the intention of the Torah, right? So what did they do? They convened a Beit Din, and you came before the Beit Din, and the Beit Din questioned you, and they said, if when you had taken this vow, you knew that at the end of the vow period, the temple would be destroyed, and you couldn't offer the sin offering, and therefore you couldn't end your Nazariteship, right? If you had known all that, would you have taken the vow, right? And presumably, the Nazarite says, no, I would not have. And the Beit Din says, okay, you're released from your vow, right? Because it's like a contract, right? You have to have full knowledge. I mean, the mekach ta'ud, like an erroneous deal. And so they released him from the vow. But here we're talking about a more normal situation. So the question is, so now it's the end of your Nazarite period. Let's say you took a vow like 7 years. Be a Nazarite for 7 years. Right now, 7 years are up, and you're ending your Nazariteship, and you have to bring a sin offering. Why? why do you have to bring the sin offering at the end of your Nazarite? Yeah, right.
Maybe because of the sins you committed before you were Nazarite, the sins you're going to commit when you're done being Nazarite, not that you would, but something that might be unintentional, because Nazarites don't generally sin.
Right, well, I don't think that the past sins, I mean, you should have brought the appropriate offerings at the right time, and there's no like, I don't know, you can't put down a down payment on future sins, right? So, but you're close, at least according to one perspective, which I'll get to, but, you know, I want to see if there's any other thoughts about why you have to bring a sin offering at the end of your Nazarite period. All right, well, all right, so Ramban, Nachmanides, he's along the same lines, not exactly what you said, Brian, but along the same lines. He said, you know, there were certain things that you weren't allowed to do, and you didn't do them, but now you're gonna do them, right? You're gonna eat meat, you're gonna drink wine, you're gonna get a haircut. You're no longer strictly prohibited from contact with the dead, so you're gonna do things. They're not exactly sins now, but they were sins before. And you're gonna do them, so that's the sin offering. So in that sense, it is, I guess, kind of like a down payment, right? Not actually, I don't know, never mind. But in the Mishnah, okay, so not money is much later, but in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says that you have to bring a sin offering for the sin of having been a Nazarite. Okay? And I heard, like, how can that be, right? How can that be when it's in the Torah, right? Well, Rabbi Elazar says that the Nazarite committed the sin of denying himself or herself. There were female Nazarites as well. You denied yourself the legitimate pleasures of the world that God created, right? God created a world filled with beautiful and good things, and he gave us rules about how to use and enjoy them. And as long as we follow those rules, that's what we're supposed to do. Okay, so like, I suppose Eliezer HaKapar would say, and again, I'm just bringing his perspective, I don't necessarily agree with him. He would say, just as it's a sin to eat treif, it's a sin to be a vegetarian, right? God created all of these delicious animals, which were described in the reading, right? That the chiefs brought. God created all these young animals and said, if you want to eat them, these are the ones that you can eat, and this is how they should be slaughtered, and so on and so forth. And you say, yeah, I'll have the tofu and I'll have the fruit plate, right? You've committed a sin because God has given you this good stuff to enjoy, and you voluntarily renounce it. And Eliezer HaKapar says that if you voluntarily renounce something that God has given you and said, enjoy, that's a sin. Okay, again, his question is, who's right? Who's right, right? We have two opposing perspectives, which is like the Jewish way, right? I mean, somebody comes to the rabbi and, you know, they're in a dispute and blah, 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 oh, you're right. And then the other litigant comes and said, yeah, you're right. And then, you know, somebody overheard said, they can't both be right. Yeah, you're right, okay? So, yeah, D, who's right?
I consider right or wrong, I'm just completely confused. I know that it's not us in the plastic dies and people do that. Why would you want to do something like that? Is it sin to do, to fulfill the requirements of being an athlete?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and it occurs to me that you're in essence echoing the perspective of Manoah's wife in the Haftorah, right? Because they make a sacrifice, and they've been talking to this guy, and they don't know that he's an angel, right? And they make a sacrifice, and then the angel miraculously ascends to heaven in the flames of the sacrifice, and Manoah's wife's husband says, "We're due. We saw an angel. God is going to kill us." And Manoah's wife says, "Well, if if his plan was to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our sacrifice," right? So really the same thing, right? Why would it be bad to do something that, God created this status, so how could it be bad?
I don't disagree with what you posed, but I think I can give them a way. If God is on mission, technically all movie, why did he create this Nazarite issue then out of whatever
Status.
religion? And how
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in general, going to the omniscience of God is gonna lead you down a bad path, right? Because you could say the same thing, right? Of anything, right? Why would an omniscient God create poisonous plants that are nevertheless attractive and kids might eat or whatever, right? So it's a legitimate question. I think it's just not a productive question. Okay, yeah.
So, we have Yom Kippur, and it's a day set aside so that you can think. So being a Nazarite for a little bit is sort of like a bigger Yom Kippur.
Right.
It gives you time to take away from your everyday. So like Jews don't become monks, they dissociate from the world. We're not supposed to dissociate from the world, but you do need a little time sometimes to break away and then come back.
Right, okay, that's a good point, but 7 years? But that's exactly the point, okay, is that. All right, I'm not gonna give you my perspective, I'm gonna give you Maimonides' perspective. Okay, and in Hilchot Nizirut, okay, Nizirut is the status of being a Nazarite, so Hilchot Nizirut is the laws of the Nazarite. Maimonides says that this is a path which is holy and praiseworthy. But in Hilchot Deot, Maimonides says this is a bad path to adopt because you remove yourself from the world. Okay, so Maimonides says this is an excellent holy path. This is a bad path because you remove yourself from the world. And the question is, Right, I mean, how can that be, right? And I think, if your analogy to Yom Kippur is entirely valid. It's entirely valid. However, if you think about it, like, Shavuot was 2 days, right? Even though there's absolutely no doubt about which day is actually Shavuot, because you know which day was Pesach. You might not know it at the time, but retroactively you do. And you count your 49 days, and voila, Shavuot, right? But it's nevertheless 2 days. Rosh Hashanah, 2 days. Why is Yom Kippur not 2 days? I mean, by the logic of second day Yom Tif, Yom Kippur should absolutely be 2 days, but it's not 2 days because most people are not capable of observing Yom Kippur for 2 days. It's a bad thing, right? And so if you want to say, a month-long Nazarite vow, all right, fine, but several years, not so fine, because our task is to be part of the world and to bring holiness into the world, not to leave the world for holiness. But how can Maimonides, I mean, I know there's all these jokes about rabbis, taking both sides, right? But this is Maimonides, right? I mean, got a hospital in Brooklyn. How can he take both positions? And because Maimonides says there are 2 different models of the virtuous life. There's the Hasid, meaning the saint. For Maimonides, that means like a saint. And the Chacham, which is the sage, right? And the saint is a person of extremes, right? The sage is more balanced, right? And Dee, you asked me a question on Shavuot, right? I talked about the sages did this, the sages did that, and who are the sages? And I flippantly said me, right? But the answer, of course, is like it's the rabbis, or for us, it's the law committee of the RA. But I have to tell you that, like, when you drive out Sundown Road to get to 70 to go to Baltimore, right? If I'm driving that with my wife, there's a farm on the left that would pass, and I point out that it's named after me because it's called Old Sage Farm, right? But to be a sage is to be balanced, and to be a chassid is to be an extremist, right? And I read a book a number of years ago about contemporary Catholicism called A People Adrift, okay, by a guy named Peter Steinfels. And he used to be the religion reporter for the Times. And Steinfels, is he Jewish? Well, his paternal grandfather was Jewish, and they bear his name, but the other 3 grandparents were Catholic, and he's a very devout Catholic. And, right, that there's a priest shortage in the United States, right? And, if you ask Catholics or non-Catholics, why is there a priest shortage? Most people are going to say celibacy, right? Because people don't want to be celibate anymore. But Steinfeld says it's not only that. It's before Vatican II, the church taught if you want to be a holy person, you must become a priest or a monk or a nun, right? And now the church says that's one path of holiness, but you can also get married and have kids and live a holy lifestyle as a family, right? And I think Steinfeld is onto something, right? And that's, in that sense, that's the Jewish way, right? Because we don't become monks, right? And we don't become monks even for 7 years. You want to become a monk for a month or whatever, great. I mean, I lived in a monastery for 10 months. I didn't actually become a monk, but I lived with monks, right? And there are, if you're, I had more to say, but I'm not gonna. But if you're in my Psalms class, I just learned about a new, well, it's not that new, but it's new to me, translation of the book of Psalms called Opening to You by Norman Fisher. And I got it, it's extraordinary. Now, who is Norman Fisher? Norman Fisher is the abbot of the Zen monastery in Berkeley. And you say, Norman Fisher, right? You don't look Buddhist, right? He's a Jew, right? But he's still a Jew, but he's re-embraced his Jewish identity while still being a Zen monk. And he produced this translation of Psalms, which is really extraordinary, but for the most part, right, maybe we should have a few people who are Hasidim, who are like fanatics. It's good to have a couple of fanatics. It really is. But I mean, like I said about a guy in my previous congregation, because he was going to the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem for the summer, and I had to write him a letter of recommendation. And I said, I am so glad that this guy is in my shul, but if there was more than one of them, I don't know what I would do, right? And there are certain people, like, you need that, right? You need that. It's like the leaven that makes the dough rise, right? But if you have a mixture that's all leaven, it's gonna taste crummy, and it's not gonna rise. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom. And we continue with the Kaddish before Musaf and Musaf service, page 155 in the Shabbat Siddur, 428.